You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining Revolution 250. This is where we remember events that took place 250 years ago this week. It's a short bonus episode from the American Revolution podcast to remember these important 250th anniversaries from the Revolutionary War. This week we remember the arrival of the British fleet in New York Harbor, which happened on July 12th, 1776. After the British were forced to evacuate Boston in March of 1776, London planners were already preparing to end the rebellion in America by sending an overwhelming force. They would land in New York City and cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. General William Howe had taken his army from Boston to Halifax. The first of his ships from Halifax sailed into New York Harbor on June 15th. By the end of June, most of General Howe's fleet of 130 ships and more than 9,000 soldiers sat just off Sandy Hook, New Jersey. But Howe's fleet was only the first phase. General Howe still awaited the arrival of his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, who was bringing a much larger fleet, as well as General Henry Clinton and his army that was returning from the Carolinas. Over the next month, patriots in New York would simply watch the enemy fleet grow and grow and grow. When General Howe arrived, he wasn't ready to engage the enemy, but he also didn't plan to leave his men stuck on ships for weeks while they awaited the remainder of the invasion force. He landed his force on Staten Island, where his men could camp and forage for fresh food. At the time, Staten Island was lightly populated, with less than 3,000 people total, and ruled by a handful of prominent families who were mostly loyalists. On July 2nd, General Howe began to disembark his troops on Staten Island, facing no military resistance, only a miserable rainstorm. The army set up camp and waited. Almost all of the 500 adult males on the island signed oaths of loyalty to the king, and the locals happily sold food to the hungry army. At the same time General Howe was approaching New York, his brother Admiral Howe had arrived in Halifax. Having found that the general had already departed, Admiral Howe immediately set sail down the coast toward New York. While en route, Admiral Howe attempted to work out a proclamation to encourage the patriots to surrender, accept a pardon, and return to British authority. Although he had no political concessions to offer, Howe relied on the threat of his military force to convince the rebels to give up their cause. After all, if one is faced with the destruction and confiscation of all property, the rape of one's family, and the possibility of being hanged, accepting that Parliament can levy a 3-cent tax on a pound of tea does not seem that outrageous an alternative. Howe had prepared not only a public proclamation, but wrote letters to colonial governors, the royal governors, not these provincial leaders who were pretending to be governors, as well as to his friend Benjamin Franklin. Now, you may recall that Howe and Franklin had spent months trying to work out a peace deal in 1774 and 1775 before Franklin finally left England to return to Pennsylvania. Howe hoped that his old friend would assist in bringing the conflict to a peaceful conclusion. On July 12th, the first of Admiral Howe's fleet arrived at Staten Island. The ships would continue to dribble in over the next few weeks, but even with over 21,000 soldiers now, the Howe brothers continued to wait. They were still expecting 3,000 more soldiers from General Clinton's mission in the Carolinas, as well as 8,000 Hessian mercenaries still on their way from Europe. So the Howe brothers sat and waited. While the Howe brothers seemed in no real hurry to do much of anything, some of their junior officers were chomping at the bit. On July 12th, only a few hours before Admiral Howe arrived, the 44-gun Phoenix and the 20-gun Rose and 3 smaller British ships caught a favorable wind and sailed up the Hudson River past Fort Washington and Fort Lee. The Continentals had built these forts with the specific intent of preventing the British from sailing up the river. The Patriot batteries fired on the ships, but inflicted only minimal damage to the rigging. One sailor had to have his leg amputated. The Patriots ended up doing more damage to themselves. The inexperienced artillery crews managed to blow up at least one gun. They tried to load the powder charge without first swabbing the barrel, As a result, the powder ignited from a spark, killing 6 members of the crew and seriously wounding several others. For Washington, this was not only a huge embarrassment, it proved that his defenses were worthless against the British Navy. They could sail up behind his forces and cut off his line of retreat whenever they wanted. He also had no idea what those ships planned to do. Some rumors suggested that they might be arming Tory regiments to launch an attack on Washington's rear. Others suggested they might be on a mission to destroy some American ships that were under construction further upriver. They might be trying to open up lines of communication with General Burgoyne's forces, who could be moving south over Lake Champlain to complete the British plan of sealing off New England from the rest of the colonies. Now, in fact, there were no real plans at all, other than to test American defenses. The ships remained upriver for a few weeks. The Patriots maintained men along the shore to oppose any attempts at landing. After facing a failed Patriot raid against the ships and a failed attempt to send fire ships at them, the British ships sailed back down the Hudson River, leading to another minor firefight with Continental artillery, before rejoining the main fleet off Sandy Hook. They did succeed, though, in proving to everyone that the American defenses were useless against the British naval domination of the rivers around New York. The Americans watched the gathering British fleet in New York Harbor continue to grow. One Continental soldier, viewing all the ships in the harbor, commented, quote, "I spied as I peeped out the bay something resembling a wood of pine trees trimmed. In about 10 minutes the whole bay was full of shipping as ever could be. I thought all London was afloat." It would be more than a month before the British actually engaged. For the moment, they simply intimidated the rebels with their sheer numbers. I hope you've enjoyed this Revolution 250 moment. For more on this story, check out episode 101 of the American Revolution podcast at blog.amrevpodcast.com. And please subscribe for free to the whole podcast on whatever podcast platform you like. Thanks again for listening to this Revolution 250 moment on the American Revolution podcast.